Howdy everybody, and welcome back to the stream. Hope everyone is having a good week so far. Happy Friday. And this evening, this presentation, we're going to cover the laws of UX. Well, some laws of UX. Not all of them, of course. That would take far too long. And in this discussion, in this presentation, I will discuss how each of the laws that I've selected here, how each of them works, and what they mean, and how they relate to each other, and how they relate to various UX heuristics, which I did a stream on last week, and you can find that on the YouTube channel. Channel name is Show Me UX. If you want a refresher on UX heuristics, those are the rules of thumb when it comes to user experience design. And a big inspiration for this week's stream comes from lawsofux.com. It's a fantastic website, fantastic resource where they go into more depth than what I'll cover here on each of the laws of UX, and they have them separated by heuristics, principles, gestalt, and cognitive bias. And while not being an exhaustive list of the user experience laws, it's a fantastic starting point, and definitely bookmarked it the first time I came across the page, so I want to refer to that one frequently. And so we'll go ahead and begin. And the first one is Jacob's Law. And I started with this one. It's the first UX law that I learned when I began learning user experience and user interface design. And it's the one that I guess refer to most often. It's the one that I think of most often. And I will bring this up again toward the end of the presentation. Bear in mind that it can be difficult to remember the names of all the different UX laws. They're all named after with the exception of, I guess, the gradient effect. They are named after the creator or the inventor, however you want to think about that, the person who discovered the law after doing the research. And it may be difficult to try to keep all these names in your head, and it's less important to remember the exact name of the law than it is to remember what the law covers. And so as long as you remember, as long as you can recall what the law is, the name is less important. Also, each law has, not each law, but many of the laws have several different names, and so depending on who you're talking to, a colleague may have a background in social sciences or a psychology degree or whatever the case may be, and they may have a different name for the law, and so bear that in mind. And excuse me. So Jacob's Law. Jacob's Law states that users spend the majority of their time on products or engaged with products other than yours. That product could be an app, it could be a website, any number of things. And so because their time is generally spent elsewhere, their expectations are formed based on the experiences they have using other products. And so when they interact, when they engage with your product, they come to your product, they come to your project with a set of expectations, and they expect your product to operate, to work in the same way that other sites that they spend all their time on, or other apps that they spend the majority of their time on, they expect it to work basically the same way. And with that in mind, the last thing you want to do, or one of the last things you want to do, is force your users or require your users to learn a new set of principles or learn a new way about how something is done. And so you want to design your product with that in mind. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, as it's stated. And so you'll want to use patterns that users are already acquainted with, they already know, they're already well accustomed to them. And I found this image right here on Google image search a bit earlier when I was putting this slide deck together. And I was trying to come up with visual representations of each law. And I also wanted to keep it clean because there are many representations that I could use for each law. And I found this image from, it looks like eli.net/blog. This is an image from June 2014. And so looking at these, the selection of all these are share icons, and the only one that really hasn't changed is Android. I use an Android, and that is the same icon. And so Google has been pretty consistent with their iconography as far as the share icon is concerned. However, we can see that iOS has changed over time, as would be expected, and the latest iOS, which I guess is 15 going on 16, uses a version of the one here for iOS 7. It's just less, I guess, pixelated, as we can see here if I zoom in a bit. It's a lot more, it's smoother. And so the idea here is, or the point of using this visual representation is when you, or I'll give you some context for when Jacob's Law could be applied. Let's say that you are creating, you're part of a team, and that team is designing an app for Android or for iOS. And the design specs state that some aspect of the design, somewhere in the design, you need to integrate a share button. So what would be wise is to use the icon that is most familiar to the users given the operating system. In this scenario, that would be the default Android share icon. And the thought process behind that is, the rationale is, since users who are in the Android ecosystem are likely used to this iconography right here, you don't want to you don't want to use a different icon to represent something, to represent an idea that they're already familiar with. So they're familiar with the idea of sharing content or sharing a link or an image or whatever the case may be, but you want to maintain consistency with your icons. And I am a proponent of using what it's called free. It's, you know, the icon's free. It's there in the system. It's already built in. You don't need to go to any extra effort to create your own icon or find an icon from a different icon set. Just use what's already baked in to the operating system. Users will be familiar with it, is a way of stating that. And so, and that ties into the first bullet point here. Don't reinvent the wheel. You want things to look like what they are in as much as possible. And by that I mean, you know, your link should look like links, and your button should look like buttons, so on and so forth. And that ties into heuristic number 2, which is, just to summarize it, things should look like the thing that they represent. Icons should look like the thing they represent. And the difficult part with iconography, having, I guess, skeuomorphic iconography, is it's difficult to it's difficult to design an icon for an abstract thought or an abstract process like sharing. That's a bit abstract. You can't touch sharing; it's intangible. And so, with that in mind, you know, use what's already been well established, which in this case would be this share icon right here. And so, by presenting the user with something they're familiar with, they're well acquainted with, or they're accustomed to seeing and using, they won't have to learn a new system. They won't have to learn your way of doing things, because that's going to be foreign to them, and that could lead to confusion and frustration dealing and interacting with your product. And you want to, of course, minimize that as much as possible. And it also ties into heuristic 4, which is consistency and standards, which is the Jacob's Law and the heuristic number 4, as put forth by the Nielsen-Norman Group. They revolve very closely together in design thinking. And so you want to, when you're thinking about consistency, this would have to do, so there's 2 types of consistency that you need to keep in mind. And that's internal consistency, which is having all your screens use the same UI patterns where possible. And there's also external consistency, and external consistency has to do with maintaining or adhering to industry standards as far as, you know, what other sites are using. And so Jacob's Law and heuristic number 4 go together very commonly. And so the next one is Tesler's Law, which states every application has an inherent amount of complexity that cannot be removed or hidden. Instead, it must be dealt with either the product development team needs to take care of all the work, or the other option is assuming or letting the user do most of the work. And excuse me. So for this for this example, I know that might be difficult to see, so I can zoom in a bit. I chose images from my project that I was working on previously, and it was an e-commerce. It was an online retailer product, and I was tasked by the product manager with coming up with some features to test possible solutions, test hypotheses, do some validation. And one of the issues was dealing with lowered conversion rates, less conversion than was expected or anticipated. And one of the hypotheses put forth by the PM, the project manager, was that creating a product comparison feature would reduce the cognitive load for the user in deciding between various models. In this case, various models of bicycle. So we have two Bianchis right here, and I was at the time fairly new to the world of e-commerce, online retailing, and my only experience with online retail or e-commerce in general so far had been, just ordering things from Amazon, which does get, that was valuable in the sense that I came to the project with some knowledge regarding proper, UI pattern usage and user flow. However, actually developing for retail turned out to be much more difficult than I had anticipated, even with the wealth of information that is available regarding best practices and so on and so forth. And so the issue that I faced throughout this was using Figma, of course, creating a system whereby users could add different bicycle models to a product comparison table, and which was on a separate screen. And even though I studied, I did all the research on various ways to do that. I checked out the main competitors and then also secondary competitors in the retail online e-commerce space, and I saw how those websites, those apps dealt with product comparison, and I tried to emulate those features as best I could. However, it was difficult, or many challenges appeared when I began the user testing phase. And as it turned out, and this is bias on my part, of course, I had wrongly assumed that users would just understand the way that I had made this design. The design choices I made, of course, made sense to me because I was the designer on them, and I, of course, wrongly assumed that they would make sense to the user base as well. Excuse me. And and they did not. And while I was doing my testing, I had two main tasks I had two goals for the users, and the first task, the users, 5 out of 5 users were able to complete it, no problem, so 100% success rate on that one. However, the second task was adding products to the comparison table, and in the first round of testing, 0 of 5 users were able to accomplish this correctly, and I do, and I know this is sort of bad practice, I do place a bit of the blame on Figma, and I kept thinking to myself, if I could just add a little bit of Java, if I could inject a bit of JavaScript into the prototype, things would work fantastic. They would work a lot better, and indeed they would. However, that is, I do understand that that's a wrong-headed way of thinking about things. It's a poor craftsman who blames their tools, of course. And so, while I do harbor a tiny bit of resentment toward Figma for disallowing me to be able to do that, I understand that's not the point of Figma. And so, I went back to the drawing board. I took a look I recorded the Zoom videos for the moderated testing, and I just replayed segments over and over and paid close attention to user behavior. And I also listened actively listened to what the users were saying, because thankfully they were speaking aloud the whole time. They were voicing their thoughts, and I was able to come to some conclusions as to why the design patterns I had put forth in the initial prototype, which is here on the left, weren't working for the user. Why there was a disconnect between the task that I was giving them in the script and the actions that took place on the user end. And once I understood that a bit better, I went on to the higher fidelity prototype, as seen here, and I changed a few things. And when I ran the test again with 5 new users and another moderated testing session, that's a better image right there. The number of users who were able to complete that task went up to 5 out of 5. So for both tasks, I had 100% success rate, 100% completion rate, I should say, not success. And I did that by removing some, I changed some UI patterns around. So I got rid of some iconography that was confusing to the users, and I added some frames that would appear with the by using transitions I made. For example, this frame down here that says add one more byte to compare, I added this little bit of text down here, and by removing some small bits of UI pattern and by adding just this little tiny UI pattern right here that would appear as an overlay in Figma, I was able to solve the problem just completely. It took much less work than I had expected, and I was surprised with these findings. But that's, in a way, that's kind of the point of doing your usability testing, is validating your hypotheses. And I was surprised, and I'm always surprised with how just a tiny bit of changing in wording or changing in microcopy or moving an icon to a different place or getting rid of an icon completely can completely alter the chain of events when you're giving a user a task. And so I bring this up to illustrate Tesler's law, and I did not know about Tesler's law until I got to the very end of this design sequence. And then when I was doing research on it, I think I was reading a Medium article, an article posted on Medium, published on Medium, I should say, that the author brought up the idea of Tesler's law, which has to do with the, as stated here, the inherent complexity in a system. Every system, every flow is going to have some just inherent baked-in amount of complexity. And I made the mistake on 2 fronts. The first issue is that I expected them to just get it. And so I was shifting the burden of understanding to the user. I was shifting the burden of the work to the user, when in reality, I should have done more work on my end, on the back end, so to speak, for the Figma prototype, so as to ease or to reduce the cognitive load of the user. Instead, I artificially increased the cognitive load by not making it clear. Well, I guess that's not artificial. I increased the cognitive load on the user by not making it abundantly clear how they were supposed to go about solving a problem or completing a task, reaching a goal. And the issue regarding Tesla's law was that in the first prototype, this one here, I made it too abstract. The scripting language is very clear with what I wanted the user to do with regard to the task. However, I made the steps required to complete the task too abstract. And of course, cognitive bias in my mind, I thought, surely this will be clear enough for the users. Well, as it turns out, it wasn't. And so I had simplified to the point of abstraction, which is one of the big takeaways with Tesler's law. And so, and I also violated heuristic number 8, which is all about aesthetic and minimalist design. I made it too minimalist. I went way too far in the wrong direction. And so what you is, on the scale of minimalist design, on the scale of minimalist design, you can definitely go too far in either direction. And as it turned out, I went too far toward the simplification end of things. And so I made things too simple. And by adding a tiny bit of complexity, I was able to get a 5 out of 5 completion rate with the task having to do with adding products to the comparison table. And so I think generally, and I would need to test this, of course, or do more research on it. I would think that generally those designers who are working with their design, maybe trying to solve an issue that came up during usability testing, perhaps the majority of issues lie with making a system too complex rather than not complex enough, which is what I did here. I suspect I may be in the majority or the minority of designers who make that issue or who make that error. However, do be aware that there is sort of a I was thinking about how to phrase this earlier, and my initial phrasing was there is an XY intercept where the amount of complexity is just right. However, upon further thinking, since every user is different and what one user may consider complex or more of a challenging task than another user, it's more like a gradient. There's going to be shades of gray as to how much complexity is going to be required, and so I started to think of it more like a bell curve, where in the middle, where the toward where the curve where the peak is, that's where you want your complexity to lie, and then there's going to be gray area on the left and gray area on the right, and so you'll want to shoot for that gray area, and you will only know where that area is after doing usability testing, and you will discover that some users may struggle with figuring out how to complete a task, while other users may find that it is sufficiently simple or sufficiently easy to complete the task, and you would tweak the complexity of the task or of the goal or what have you based on user feedback, having done your user research, which is why it's important to do almost nonstop user research, of course, as your budget allows, as your time allows. You have all these constraints you need to work within. And so we'll move on to Postel's law. And Postel's law, this might be more germane to, or more applicable to your devs, or possibly your front end team, your back end team. And Postel's law states that be liberal in what you accept and conservative with what you send. And the wording on that is a bit abstract. It's not as straightforward as many of the other explanations of the laws or definitions of the laws. And to illustrate this, I put together this framed bit here in Figma, and this would be part of a form. And in the input field here in the control, this is where a user I have e-commerce on the brain. This is where a user who is in the checkout process would type in their credit or debit card number or gift card number, or whatever the case may be. And savvy viewers who know that I'm very tough on form UI patterns will notice that I did not put a hint down here. A hint is a bit of copy that would exist below the label but above the control, the input, wherein you would specify possibly, for example, if this said CVV, that your hint might say found on back of card. Or for card number, a hint right here could say, XXX-XXX, so on and so forth, to indicate the format that the card number needs to be put in. However, Postel's law would point you toward accepting a variety of input formats for a card. And so we have 3 different input. This is a fake credit card number up here. And so we have 3 different ways of putting the card number in. The first one has spaces every 4 characters, every 4 integers, like one might see on a card. If you were to look at your debit or credit card, sometimes there are spaces every 4 characters. Sometimes there's dashes. Sometimes it all runs together. and the end user who is typing this information in, might have, if it's not saved to the browser or in their phone, they might look at their credit card and see, or their debit card for that matter, and see the way that the numbers are listed on the card. And again, the card might have dashes, spaces, it might run together, and so they might type in to this input field the way that the numbers appear on the card. And as the designer or as the devs, you want to be very forgiving in the way that you accept the information. And so regardless of how regardless of how the user inputs this information, whether or not they use spaces, they might have everything run together, they might even use dashes. It would be wise to accept all of these different ways. And that is the liberal in what you accept portion of it. The conservative in what you send aspect of it would be there are very strict protocols in place, incredibly strict protocols for a reason in place when data is being sent. And so maybe API, the connection between, so the user puts all their information in and hits the buy now or the submit button or whatever the microcopy might say. And the information that's sent, the billing information that's sent to the third-party authenticator, whether that be the credit card, what am I trying to say here? The institution or the website or the company that takes a look at all this information and says, yes, this is correct information. There aren't any errors here. Okay, the payment looks okay. The payment processor, that's what I'm looking to say. The information that's the payment processor is very strictly defined and in the way that it is formatted. And so you can accept any number of ways of input from the user, but you need to be very specific in how you send that out. So there won't be any problems with the payment processor. And so reading these bullet points toward the bottom, you want to be empathetic to, flexible without, intolerant of any of the various actions the user could take or any input they might provide. And you want to anticipate virtually anything in terms of input, access, and capability while providing a reliable and accessible interface. And this ties heavily into user experience heuristic number 3, user control and freedom, which is you want to, users are going, despite what your red routes might look like, users are going to go about completing tasks in a variety of ways, whatever they think is best or whatever they're used to doing. And so by not boxing them into one specific method of doing things, you allow them the control over the experience. And that results in a more satisfied customer and less friction between the product interface and the user. And it also, Postel's law also ties into usability heuristic number 5, which is error prevention. And error prevention is somewhat, it is somewhat related to another user experience heuristic, which is, I forget the exact definition of it, but it is useful and helpful error messages. And while that heuristic is useful in the situations where you're going to have errors, usability heuristic number 5 is error prevention. And the best way to not have errors is to, of course, have constraints, but then also be open to different, in this case, with regard to Postel's law, be liberal in what you accept. And so how error prevention ties into this would be by accepting not any, but a wide variety of input methods for, in this case, card numbers. You will, by not focusing on just having one exact correct way of doing it, like, for example, if the server requires, the payment processor requires just one string of integers with no spaces, no dash, no extra characters or anything like that, by requiring that of the user, you are opening the design up, or you're opening up the user to experience errors because they might put it in any number of ways. And so error prevention could be invoked by, again, accepting a wide variety of input types or input methods, input formats, I should say, so as to not ding the user for putting it in a different way, maybe the way that it appears on the card. And so That is sort of a loose explanation of Postel's law. And moving on, we have Hicks' law, which states the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and complexity of choices. And I chose, let's see here. Excuse me, I have 3 images here. And these images were taken, these are screenshots from my phone that I snagged when I was doing my competitive analysis, my analysis of the competitors for the retail project, the e-commerce project that I was working on. And I went to 3 different websites, and the competitors were Target, Amazon, and Trek. And I closely examined their checkout procedures, their checkout flow on mobile, at any rate. And what I found was quite surprising, actually. And I found that Target was a big offender when it came to violating a number of heuristics and a number of laws, and I could have included these screenshots on any number of these slides in this presentation, but I chose Hicks' law because I think it best represents the problem that's we see here. And so I'm going to zoom in on Target a little bit here, and this is the overlay that appears. You can see that the background here is grayed out a bit here. This is the overlay that appears when you are on Target's mobile site and you add a product to the cart. And as we can see here, we have confirmation added to cart. That's very helpful. We have the close button, very helpful. And then after that, I was just overwhelmed overloaded with all the information given here. And the CTA is right here. Is protect your purchase, and then the secondary or tertiary, whichever button style, is right here for decline coverage. And aside from this, whether or not this is dark UX pattern is a subject for another stream. But all of this information had to do with trying to get me to purchase Allstate insurance for the purchase. And they made this page so complicated or so complex that it was difficult for me to, and I didn't actually complete the purchase. I just needed to do sort of a straw purchase, or get all the way to the end, but not actually complete the purchase to get all the screens I needed. However, I was shocked at how complex they made this, what I would take to be a rather simple choice, how complex they made this process. And in this case, it was just an overwhelming amount of information. And I understand that Target, of course, has a deal with Allstate, where Target, of course, gets some of the revenue from the choice of the user to protect their purchase with insurance from Allstate's protection plan here. However, the way they presented it, there was a tremendous spike in my cognitive load as a user when I saw this page, or when I saw this overlay, and it was just overwhelming. And I was very confusion. I felt confusion, and then also felt frustration because I couldn't figure out what they wanted, even though there was a very clear primary button right here. Their CTA was clear. I was, again, confused by the amount of text here, and I could see how which as a user turns me off. I'll just I'll back away from the product for a minute and spend as much time as necessary to understand what's going on. However, I would definitely understand if some users faced with a screen like this would, in their confusion, they might opt to just tap whatever the primary button is, just to get away from this page. And in that scenario, that could be these design choices would be seen or would be understood as dark UX. However, sort of preying on users whose natural inclination is just tap whatever button is there to get them away from this nearly, and I'm sort of being a bit sarcastic here, nearly insurmountable amount of information that seemingly has nothing to do with their choice of purchase. And so this is definitely too much information, and could be broken up into could be broken up or chunked elsewhere. This information could appear later on in the checkout process, the checkout flow. And so, focusing a bit on the bullets down here, break up into a way to avoid violating Hicks law would be break up information into, or break up tasks into multiple parts. And a good way to think about that is, or an example of that would be, if you are designing forms. Let's say you are working on an onboarding process, or if you might be working on an e-commerce or online retailer checkout process. A good idea, or definitely an idea, one of the better ideas that I've seen when I was doing my research, is the idea of one thing at a time, using that pattern in forms. And so what that might look like, let's say for an onboarding process, would be only asking for a limited amount of, let's say you need you need answers to 5 questions in order to complete the onboarding process. Well, instead of asking those 5 questions on the first screen, you break that up into 5 screens. Or if some questions made sense, if they were together, maybe 3 or 4 screens, instead of giving the user all those questions on one screen to where you have to just keep on scrolling to see all the content. That's a bit overwhelming for the user, and again could lead to frustration and confusion, which of course you want to avoid. And use progressive strategies where applicable. What that means, what progressive strategies, what that means is only giving the user, or only presenting the user with as much information as is necessary for that particular screen, or in that for that portion of a particular task, not giving them so much information that it's overwhelming. And that is target on this screen, for example, and there were many screens to choose from. I had a wealth of options available for the visual aid on this slide. Could have definitely benefited from using a progressive strategy. And an example of how that might have looked is removing, zoom in, removing this area right here that says protect your purchase, and this sort of light gray card with these 2 buttons right here, moving that to a separate page. So that not only would that reduce the cognitive load, but it would it would reduce the cognitive load, and that would be an example of a progressive strategy, not to give the user all the information that the site has all at once. We're not trying to upsell all at once. Indeed, this is an example of Target trying to upsell, and there's nothing inherently wrong with upselling. Just as a side note, it's a strategy many businesses use. Anytime you add, like in this example here, or in this scenario, anytime you add something to cart and the system says, "Hey, for an additional X amount of money, you could get away. You could add, add another one to the cart to receive, 10% off, or whatever the case may be." And that's a viable retail strategy, and it might feel, depending on your viewpoint on the issue, that might feel a bit gross, or whatever the case may be. However, if you are working on a product that does that involves retail or upselling at any certain point, be very careful with how and when you present that information to the user, because you don't want to turn them off. You don't want to lower conversion with regard to the upsell, or for the sell at all, by overloading the user with too much information, increasing the cognitive load, as it were. And so, all this law ties into Tesler's law, the one we saw, 2 slides ago, which is avoid information overload, but don't oversimplify. Don't do what I did. Don't go so far in the other direction where the user is wondering, where the user has questions during the checkout process that aren't answered on the screens. And this ties back in to user experience heuristic number 8, which is aesthetic and minimalist design. Be as minimalist in your design as possible, while still giving the user all the information that they need to successfully complete a task. And that's going to vary from project to project, product to product, app to app, website to website. And you will only know exactly where that line is or where that gradient is by doing lots of user testing, or at least doing some user testing. Some user testing is far better than testing one user is by far beats testing 0 users. And I included Amazon in the middle here. And Amazon does a much better job than Target does in basically every single screen of their checkout process, their checkout flow. And so I wanted to include that here as sort of a good in the middle example of not giving the user too many choices, but giving them just the right amount of choices, and not overloading them with too much information. I would put an asterisk at the end of that last sentence. I think there is a little bit too much information on this screen for my liking. However, it's not nearly as bad as Target is over here. And the funny thing is, if you were to do a word count on each one of these screens, I suspect that Amazon may have more words on the page than Target. However, the way they're presented, the patterns that are used, makes it appear that Amazon actually gives less information, while in fact they may give more. And again, I think Amazon could maybe do a bit better as far as which is just one user's opinion, just my opinion on their pattern choices for their checkout process. But on the other hand, I don't want to be, or I want to stay as far away from narcissism as I can. And what I mean by that is, I don't want to. So Amazon's to say Amazon is a huge company is a bit of an understatement, and I know that Amazon has numerous teams on top of teams, who all they do is UX and UX research all day. And this screen here this is not an accident. This is, this design didn't just, come out of the ether. This is design that's based on just hours and hours and years of research. At this point, decades of research have gone in to making every single pixel on this screen appear exactly where it needs to be, based on user feedback, user research. And so far be it from me to be armchair UX guy and just say, oh, they could do better, they could fix this, that, and the other. They have teams of people who work 40, 80 hours a week determining exactly where things should be. And so this is the result of that. And so my opinion differs a little bit, but again, not all users are the same. And then I did include as a good example of what I think is proper minimalist design in this screenshot to the right here. And this is the trekbikes.com checkout process. This is the first step of the Trek Bikes checkout process. And they were kind enough to include a progress bar at the very top, which is nice because it helps me know exactly where I am. And this comes up, the idea of the progress bar comes up a bit later, possibly even in the next slide. And Trek's website did a lot of things correct. They did one or two things, I won't say wrong. They made a couple of design decisions that I didn't exactly agree with. However, I was pleasantly surprised with Trek's checkout flow, and indeed Trek's product comparison flow. I thought it was probably about as seamless as it can get on mobile. And what Trek did was when you get into, and you'll see this quite often with more UX mature, with retailers who have a higher level of UX maturity, you'll tend to see this, where the checkout process will be sort of a minimalized version of the website overall. And so if you go to Trek Bikes and you just surf around their website, and then go to the checkout flow, you'll notice that it's missing a lot of the UI patterns that you will see elsewhere. There's not much in the way of images. I mean, yes, they do have the Trek, Electra, and Bontrage logos here at the top. However, that amount of this amount of graphics I think is appropriate, because if nothing else, it kind of reminds you where you are. If these weren't here, that would be a bit strange. There would be no site ID outside of the URL here. And of course, if I were to scroll up on my phone, the URL bar would here in the task, it would disappear. And so this helps ground the user, lets them know where they are, more or less. And so this is a fantastic version of what a checkout process should look like. It's not too much information, and I'm not left, I didn't have any, it answered all of the questions that I had. It gave me just the right information at just the right time using the correct UI patterns. And I enjoyed doing my fake checkout on the Trek site. And so I thought they did a fantastic job with delivering just the correct amount of complexity with my needs at that time, given the task I had going through their checkout process. And yeah, just minimalist enough, just the right aesthetic choices. And so we'll move on to Miller's Law. And Miller's Law states that the average person, or the average user, I should say, can only keep 7 plus or minus 2 items in their working memory. And huge caveat with this one. None of these laws are written in stone, which sounds weird when you're talking about laws. However, like heuristics and like everything having to do with user experience, user interface design in general, you always have to keep in mind that it depends. And Miller's Law, 7 plus 2 plus or minus 2, so 5 to 9, anywhere from 5 to 9 things in their memory at any given point. You always have to remember that every user is different, and some users can remember a tremendous amount of things, and some users cannot remember maybe even 1 or 2 things at a time, and so which is an accessibility concern. And so you'll want to do everything that you can to assist the user in by assist the user, I mean you want to do everything you can to essentially avoid having the user have to remember things. And so and I believe I used this analogy 1 or 2 streams ago, but the shopping cart is a good way to think about this. And so when you are at the market, or you're at the store, and you either have a basket or one of those totes that you can carry with you, when you are adding items to your cart, anytime you want to see what's in the cart, you just need to, essentially look down, look at the cart, and provided products aren't covering one another, you can quickly assess what you have added. And if you have a shopping list, you can check against the 2 and determine what you have yet to pick up and what you've already picked up. And so you don't need to add multiple items, and you don't forget things. And so that reduces so that reduces the amount of cognitive load on the user and having to remember a lot of things, especially while they're trying to complete maybe the parent task, which is go to the market, buy things, and return home. The set of subtasks in that case would be, or the child task would be, remembering everything that's on the cart, not forgetting anything, and not buying too much of one thing. And so e-commerce, modern e-commerce, does a fantastic job of that. This is a screenshot here of the Amazon cart that I created when I was doing my sort of fake checkout process in order to gather a bunch of screens for the competitor analysis. And at any given point, so I had the option, the control was mine, the power was mine to look at the cart anytime I wanted. I could go to the cart and clearly see everything that I had added to the basket prior to shopping, or prior to checking out, I should say. And that way I didn't have to, and I added loads of stuff. I think the number on the cart was like 24. I had 24 or 25 items added to the cart. And yeah, about item 7, I started to lose the capacity to list every single thing that I had added to the cart so far. And so by having this overview of all the products that I had added to the basket, it allowed me to, or it freed my memory up to focus on more important things, such as, or in this case, shopping for additional items I hadn't added yet, or if I was debating between 1 or 2 items, that amount of cognitive energy was directed toward making decisions rather than having to keep all these things in my head at once. And so this Miller's Law ties in to Hicks' Law, which, should be here. The time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and complexity of choices. And so how Hicks' Law and Miller's Law intertwine, and how many of these laws intertwine has to do with cognitive load. And I know I've used that phrase many times throughout, but it is applicable. And so by breaking up complex tasks, by chunking information, you reduce the burden on the user to have to remember a lot of things all at once in order to successfully complete a task. And if you give them, or if you make it too complex for the user, they are going to get confused, frustrated, and if they're frustrated or confused enough, they're going to exit your app, or they're going to leave your site and use a competitor site, and get done what they need to get done over there because they provide a better user experience. And excuse me. Miller's Law also ties into usability heuristic number 6, which is recognition versus recall. And if you recall back from that stream where I discussed that law, or I went over that law, recognition versus recall is the idea of not requiring or provide the user with the information based on the decisions they have already made. Like I made the decision to add these items to the cart, and so by giving me that information, or by showing me that information by way of the shopping cart feature, I'm able to recall what I see, or I'm able to recognize the things that I have added rather than having to remember each one of them. And when you're given the option recognition versus recall, recognition wins every single time, because all I need to do is look at it and say, yes, I did do that, rather than thinking, did I add the right graphic novel or bicycle to the cart there? And again, here's Tesla's law creeping on in. Avoid information overload, but don't oversimplify. And so as we proceed throughout this presentation, we start to see the connections being drawn between each one of these ideas, and each of the ideas also connect to the heuristics. The heuristics, the UX heuristics and the UX laws are they are intertwined. They cannot be separated. And let's see here. So moving on from Miller's Law to yes, here's our progress bar, the goal gradient effect. And this law, it says effect, but it's also a law, states that the tendency to approach a goal increases with the proximity to a goal. And so per the bullet points down here, the closer users are to completing a task, the faster they work toward reaching it. And so in order to encourage the user to complete the task, you would want to provide a clear indication of progress, even if it is artificial, in order to motivate the users to complete the task. And a side effect, a positive side effect of including, for example, a progress bar would be that it helps orient the user, which in turn reduces confusion and frustration. And that's I would argue that is an accessibility issue, always orienting the user. So at any given point, the user, and I forget which number UX heuristic this is, but you always want the user to know where they are in a process. If they're not in a process, let's say that they are at your website, and your information doesn't matter how large your information architecture is, it doesn't matter how many pages are in your website hierarchy, wherever they are, wherever page that they are on, or whatever screen they're on in your app, they need to know where they are in relation to all of the other pages. How I put quotes on this, how far are they from the home page? How far away from, or how close are they to the contact page or the about page? Or if they need help, how far away are they from reaching an FAQ or maybe a chatbot? And so you ground the users so they always know where they are either in a process or just in, if they're looking at content, for example, where they are in the information hierarchy, where they are in the map. And so as seen in the Trek example here, Trek included very, very wonderfully a progress bar at the very top, and it lists three areas or three points in the process of checking out. So we had filling in the delivery details, filling in the delivery method information, and then lastly filling in the billing information. And so by including that information, which Amazon and Target did not have a progress indicator. By including that information, I knew where I was, and I knew I had a better understanding of how far away the goal was. And when I know where the goal is, I'm more likely to accomplish it because I can see the milestones approaching that goal along the way. Even if I haven't passed them yet, I can see where they are. They're clearly labeled. I know what happens at each milestone. And so I have a more fleshed out mental map of what the entire process looks like. And so, per the goal gradient effect, my tendency to complete the goal is going to relate to how close I think the goal is, and or my proximity to the goal. And that doesn't necessarily mean that. How do I say this? So, what the goal gradient effect points to is, if I know that I'm closer to finishing the goal, the more likely I am to finish it. And so if I'm at step 3 of this, looks like 3-step process, if I know that I'm on step 3, the next step is the completion of the process, a screen that says, process completed, or your order is being shipped, or whatever the case may be. I'm more likely to complete that task than I would be at step 1, for example. However, if I had no progress bar at all, I would be significantly overall less likely to complete the task because I would have no idea how long the task is to begin with. And I might decide, if I didn't have this information, and I didn't know that I was on step 3, the last step, I might decide at that point that this is taking too long. Who knows how many steps follow this one, and I might just abandon the whole process, not knowing that the next step, or the step that I'm currently on, 3, is the last step. And so by informing users of where they are in the system, that's going to reduce confusion and frustration, and it's going to possibly lead to increased conversion rates by having the user be aware of how close they are to completing the task. If they know how close they are to completing the task, they'll be more likely to complete it, especially if they know that they are 1 or 2 steps away from completing the task. So that is the idea of the goal gradient effect. And that is the end of the laws that I wanted to highlight. I wanted to focus on only a few laws, in this case 7. And again, there are dozens of laws governing UX and UI practices, and I didn't want to overload. This presentation could have quite easily gone on for far too long. I didn't want to give too many of the laws, and if you are interested in UX laws, and I highly suggest reading up on them, do check out lawsofux.com, which is just a fantastic resource. And as we can see here, we have many laws given, and you can sort them by heuristic, principle, gestalt, and cognitive bias laws. And of course, if you were to click on one, for example, the Doherty threshold, you'll get an overview, you'll get takeaways, and then you'll get a little bit of information about the origins, which I find really interesting. Not, some designers may regard that more as trivia, which, sure, I can see that. It's not necessarily important to know the origins of the Doherty threshold. But there's also resources, further reading, links that you can click on that go into much more depth on each law. And so, again, go to the site, bookmark it, refer to it often. Laws of UX is awesome. And as I've brought up many times throughout this presentation, everything is connected. Laws and heuristics, they don't exist inside a vacuum. That is to say, no heuristic, no law stands alone or stands apart from any other heuristic or law. Everything influences everything else, which is why, on Miller's Law, I reminded you to think about heuristic number 6 and how that melds with the law. And also, when you think of Miller's Law, maybe you also think of Tesler's Law and how they interact. And so everything is connected, and I could have made this image here a lot larger, but I got tired of drawing with the line tool. And this isn't meant to be this isn't meant to be a realistic web of interconnectedness. However, the point that I mean to get across here is it's helpful when you are developing, or if you have developed, it may be helpful to think of laws and heuristics in your design thinking methodology as all being sort of connected as sort of planets with moons that just revolve around each other. And so, as I stated toward the beginning, don't try to remember, or what I sort of indicated at the beginning of the presentation is don't try to remember all the laws at once. That's why sites like Laws of UX exist, so you can go to that resource and get information on laws as you need them. And when I first began, the only law that I knew was Jacob's Law, and that's only because it's the first one I learned, and it was in the education track we went into it pretty heavily, and so it's sort of really etched on my mind there. A lot of these laws will come to you as you find out about them in the wild. The example I gave was I was unaware of Tesler's law until I made a mistake that violated Tesler's law. And then I found out about it, and now, just like Jacob's Law, it's definitely in my head. It's not going anywhere, and so I can think about that, or I can identify it when I see it done correctly or a violation thereof. And again, the names of the laws are less important than the laws themselves, which should have a period at the end of it. And so, if you have to choose one or the other, the name of the law or actually remembering what the law states, just think about the idea of the law, or what the law states is more important than the law itself. And so it's sort of like if you're going through a math course, for example, and you're learning some maybe upper tier mathematics, or 300 or 400 level mathematics, you'll be presented, depending on course, you'll be presented with many laws or aphorisms or name of logic units that are named after the inventor or the describer or whoever first found it. And the best example I can think of right now is, well, not necessarily Euclid, but the Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's more important to know when to use the Pythagorean theorem, and it's more important to know the equation or the formula involved with it than knowing about than knowing that it's called the Pythagorean theorem, or knowing about Pythagoras and who he was and how he came up with it, which is indeed fascinating, but not all students will find that fascinating. And so I would focus more on the laws themselves than the names, because it can be difficult to remember because it's a bunch of people's names, which I've never been a huge fan of that. That being said, if I came up with a law, I'd probably name it after myself. And the last slide is the too long didn't read slide. And so it's foolishness, or it's a fool's errand to try to condense all the laws down into one pithy saying, because some of the laws are just totally exempt from that. And so I didn't want to oversimplify things, but I did want to come up with sort of a general motto or takeaway for this entire presentation, and that would be don't make the user think. Don't make the user think. And if you have not read or acquired a copy of Steve Krug's fantastic book called Don't Make Me Think, which is published a long time ago, a new edition has come out. I have it behind me. That includes some information about web usability, because when this book first came out, mobile web wasn't really a thing, or at least was in its infancy, and so Steve Krug didn't comment on it at the time. However, it's a really quick read. It's all plain language, not too many pages. You can read it in a day or two. And I would highly suggest checking this out. But that is sort of the lesson overall of understanding UX heuristics and UX laws, is don't make the user think. And bearing in mind that there is going to be some inherent complexity in everything you do, or every product or project that you work on. And so some thinking on part of the user will always be involved, but your job as the UX designer is to reduce that cognitive load, reduce that burden on the user as much as possible, while at the same time maintaining clarity. And so there's that XY intercept of clarity versus simplification, and you want to make sure that those match up, and there's sort of a gradient. There's a gray area on the top, bottom, left, and right of where that exact point is, that you will discover what that looks like during your usability testing. However, know that it does exist and you want to shoot for that. And the only way you know what that is, of course, usability testing. And so, again, it's the designer's job to do as much of the heavy lifting as possible. And the designers, the design team, and the dev team who you interact with and collaborate with, there's going to be constraints on both ends, and usually that's time and money and skill on the part of both teams, but it's not the user's job to do the hard work. It's the design team's job. So always bear that in mind. And basically give the appropriate information at the right time, on the right screen, with the right patterns. And that's going to be difficult to know unless you do your user research. And so all roads lead to user research, and then proper understanding of it, proper synthesis of that research. So that is the end of this presentation, and I appreciate you joining me this Friday evening. And later on this evening, I will, after I run this video through Media Encoder, make sure it's nice 2K, I'll upload it to the YouTube channel, and you can find it by doing a search on YouTube for Show Me UX. That's the channel name. Of course, here on Twitch, go ahead and subscribe, go ahead and follow me, and you can sign up for notifications to get an alert as to when I go live, which is every, Tuesday and Friday at 7:30 Central Standard Time. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend. Of course, if there's any questions, you can find me at the usual places, Slack, Discord, and Skype. And I'll see you next week. Have a good one.